Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Our guest today is Jeff Howell, the executive director and chief counsel of the Global Accountability Network. Good afternoon, Jeff. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, happy to. So I think we should probably start to help everybody level set with what is the Global Accountability Network?
Absolutely. So, and I will apologize in advance for any interchangeable mentions to Global Accountability Initiative. We did recently change our name, so if I switch back and forth between GAI and GAN, I do apologize in advance. It's the same organization. But the Global Accountability Network is a network of former international prosecutors, current law students, and practitioners across the world who are seeking to advance cases against the perpetrators of atrocity worldwide. It was started as a law clinic at the Syracuse University College of Law in 2011 by Professor David Crane, who remains a prominent member of our board. And at that time, it was designed to teach the practice and procedure of the international courts through real-world exercises and investigations. And it was based on the models and lessons learned by Professor Crane and his team in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which successfully prosecuted Charles Taylor, ISSA, and several other individuals for crimes that were committed in that conflict. And at that time, that court borrowed from some of the jurisprudence of previous tribunals, to include that established by the illustrious Robert Jackson and its name to the center. But it also reinvented the modern application of that jurisprudence in a lot of ways that it endured. And it achieved for the first time the prosecution of the sitting head of state for atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And it also made some groundbreaking jurisprudence on several other areas of crimes that had not been adjudicated. But at that time, it was sort of standing up a new integration between the Sierra Leonean courts and the UN justice system, as it were, in this sort of hybrid model. And being situated for the first time since Nuremberg in the forum in which the crimes occurred was also a very key portion of the success that the tribunal experienced, in that it was able to do a widespread victim integration and public outreach programs to really figure out, is the justice that the court is seeking the justice that the victims want and need to rebuild their country? And so that was an interesting and different approach from some other tribunals that I think was really a big key to its success. Sort of building off of that, the Global Accountability Network has started its methods in 2011 in Syria, where it tied into key stakeholders such as the Syrian coalition. Several members of the Syrian Accountability Project traveled abroad and helped train some of the investigators in the ways of ICL investigations. In particular, the reporting that comes out of atrocity situations is typically very documentary and journalistic, which is wonderful and it's very valuable. But when you're transitioning from that sort of what is happening on the ground to who is responsible for it, and how do we obtain justice for the victims of the atrocities these individuals have committed, it's a different process, and the information is collected and analyzed differently. And so we realized that there was a need for an organization to train individuals that were seeking to support not just awareness and documentation or truth and reconciliation, but prosecutions in courtrooms. And so the Syrian Accountability Project started in a cornerstone system that has several cornerstone documents, the first of which is a conflict narrative, which is a chronological summary of the conflict, sort of the widest portion of the fund, you might say. And it relays the key incidents, the key geopolitical developments, and everything that's happening on a chronological basis. And the next document is a crime-based matrix in which the incidents are put near the potential sources of international but also domestic penal law that can be used to prosecute certain incidents. That helps with a principle that was used in Sierra Leone called representational charging. And really the concept of that is ensuring that the indictments that are ultimately handed down in a transitional justice or an atrocity situation reflect the actual scope and nature of the crime suffered in each region. When you're dealing with something as wide as an atrocity or war crime situation, there's no way to prosecute every individual responsible. In fact, the mandate of the court was to prosecute only those most responsible for atrocity crimes, and that was one of the reasons for its success, is to focus on those who can be prosecuted at the highest level of their responsibility. And that's why it was able to achieve its mandate so quickly and so completely. And so as we start to narrow these incidents down to, well, here's the incident, here's the crime that it represents, then the funnel gets thinner and we get into our case dossiers, which identify the most responsible parties and the most egregious incidents. And our methods there are informed by prior jurisprudence, but also some of the lessons that are employed by prosecutors to include at the ICC in the case of preliminary examinations and selecting incidents or atrocities to investigate and prosecute. There's a list of elements that they apply that include the gravity and the temporal scope of the crimes, and trying to identify, now with all these incidents, which do we prosecute? And so those dossiers are designed to identify those individuals, incidents. And then the last portion of the funnel is really when we try to tie those most responsible parties to a most egregious incident in the form of a sample indictment. And so at that point, we begin drafting the indictments, and it's a notice pleading sort of system where we don't try to get too far into the weeds. We plan on having enough to put the defendant or the wrongdoers on notice, what they would be accused of. And then we use a system of annotations, which identifies relative to those counts. And this is really where we try to eliminate duplications of efforts across the worldwide effort, is to say, here's all the documentation that ties this most responsible party to this most egregious incident. And here's the evidence we don't have. And the goal behind that is to really circulate that among our confidential partners, key stakeholders in the region, so that we can figure out, with all of these wonderful efforts that are going on, how close are we to actual prosecutions of individuals responsible. And so that's really where we make a unique contribution that we think will hopefully help in employing limited resources towards actual prosecutions, is to try to narrow that.
I have to imagine trying to coordinate, and I think if I recall correctly, it's a collaboration of NGOs, in-country attorneys and other investigators, students, potentially both law students and other people on the ground. I'm sure that there is, depending on the government entity being investigated, there might be some government coordination. And I have to imagine trying to just corral the information that everybody thinks they have is a monumental task in and of itself.
It absolutely is, and there are some wonderful efforts going on that are assisting with that. That actually our board was also involved in assisting with, such as the Triple AIIMS in Syria, where there are state and multinational efforts that are happening to start that process. But unfortunately, there just aren't those types of resources for every incident that's out there. And so what GAN is attempting to do with each situation that we focus on is to take our model and allow it to be used to start a repository and a clearinghouse of evidence for every atrocity situation that's out there, and we hope to grow to where we have that capacity for any such atrocity situations. We are trying to answer for that challenge.
And right now there are 3 projects that GAN is helping to coordinate or involved with. So you mentioned the one in Syria. There is one in Yemen, and then one just recently starting in Venezuela.
That's correct. And so those projects are largely housed at, and this is one of the keys to our success, has been housing these projects at support chapters at law schools in the United States, in Europe, and in Canada, to where we've got the ability to involve law students who have a passion and an interest in this area of the law, which helps provide value added for the effort, because they get to learn and be instructed in these methods and really answer for an area that has few opportunities, particularly for Americans, just because of the posture of the United States with a lot of the different tribunals. So it provides a benefit to those students, but our organization also benefits from having dedicated volunteers who have helped us get through a lot more information than we could have without them. SAP in particular has tens of thousands of pages of data amassed and analyzed because of its law student populations. So we stood up a similar chapter at Case Western Reserve University, which is headed up by Professor James Johnson, in which we've started that model. We're now in our second year, and we are really starting to see those cornerstone documents start to come to maturity. And it was our first successful transition from the model that we had in Syria to a new situation. And even more, in its infancy is the Venezuela Project, which we just started with our partners at McGill University and the University of Toronto. So having that law student and faculty support is really a key portion of our operation, and it's wonderful to be able to rely upon that and be able to provide that also to our volunteers.
And our audience is familiar with both Professor Crane and Professor Johnson, both of whom have been T guests as well. David and I talked about how the virus is allowing leaders to usurp or consolidate power. And Jim and I talked about the residual court and sort of giving people a history of the mechanisms and the various, how we get from point A to point B in the international tribunals. So you mentioned while we were preparing for this that the Venezuela Project also recently received a grant that will enable it to really get up and going.
Yes, we are working closely with the Organization of American States and other stakeholders in the area, and we are hopefully going to be starting the process here, I would believe, in the next few months, beginning the legal research necessary to sort of undergird all of the efforts. The first portion of any key case, as any good attorney or investigator knows, is you look at the substantive law relative to the facts, and you figure out what is the strategy going to look like for ultimate prosecution. We're going to start those efforts over the summer, and then when our university support chapters and friends at McGill and Toronto reopen in the fall, then we can start the efforts of information gathering at that time. So it's an exciting time for the project, and we're very excited to move forward with our friends at OAS.
That's wonderful. So for the project in Syria, that started in 2011, which was pretty close to the beginning of the Syrian conflict, if I'm remembering my world events correctly. And then the project in Yemen, you said, started about 2 years ago, so 2018. And then Venezuela, obviously, just sort of getting off the ground now. So my understanding is that you would want to begin the documentation process, or at least have an understanding of what might need to be collected, probably as early in a conflict as possible, because otherwise you run the risk of losing something. So what do you look for? How do you know when to start the process?
Well, that's a great question, and with Syria in particular, our organization was actually approached by several stakeholders in the region that could already see these things happening and had the foresight to say, we want to start this documentation process now, and we want to seek assistance, and so that was really a homegrown effort that we supported. That happens a lot in these cases where organizations, NGOs that are interested in the region are reaching out to organizations and somehow getting put in touch with us, by providence, and we start assisting. But the sooner the better for several reasons, not the least of which is when you have limited resources, you can only spend so much money on efforts that don't render the desired product so many times before you start to see a weighting of perhaps the level or the accuracy of reporting. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the nightmare scenario everybody looks to is the ICTY, right, where there's still prosecutions ongoing, and some of the major perpetrators passed away in prison before their cases could be complete. The evidence required was not available, or was not, the chain of custody was not perhaps preserved. These are all issues that if you get into it sooner, it's easier to be able to identify what can we do with open source information and what needs to be done with the assistance of local partners. And there are a lot of wonderful organizations out there that do have partners in region who you can sort of start to see, well, Like one of the examples I would say, I don't want to get too far into sources and methods, but when comparing a Syria to a Venezuela, for example, sometimes the perpetrators are a little bit more vocal specifics of their plan, and sometimes it's to mobilize their support, and sometimes it's to maybe dehumanize the other side. And that rhetoric gives us a lot of what we need to establish some of the intent or the targeting motives or things that would be in the sort of LOAC analysis of whether or not an unlawful targeting has occurred. Sometimes they're a little bit more tight-lipped, and so now you have to turn to more documentary type evidence, which, as we saw with the yield of the report with Syria, it's there. It's these governments are documenting their own systematic killing of their citizens, and having the partnerships in place to obtain that information early is essential before that evidence is either destroyed or put in such an inaccessible position nobody can get to it. So fortunately, we were able to mobilize in Syria and get that information to the where it was needed, and continue our efforts. And as our colleague Professor Crane is so fond of saying, that the law is here, the facts and the evidence are here. Whether or not a prosecution occurs, it's all about politics. If the political will is there to prosecute war criminals in Syria, the evidence is there, and the law is there. We like to have our repository in a position where when the will does arise, we have the ability to use our indictments and our case dossiers, hand them over to a domestic prosecution or an international prosecution effort, and have them be 20 years ahead of somebody, say, that if they had just started their efforts now. And we hope to see the situation in Syria abate, but as we know, these things take time. So we're hoping to make path to justice a short one when we are able to advance those prosecutions.
We'll get to some of the fairly recent movements in Syria, or in the prosecutions for Syria, in a moment. But I want to also just follow up on, you've talked about documentary evidence. I want to just give our audience a sense of both what types of information are you collecting, in case some people have in their head, like it has to be written down kind of thing, or, does documentary mean video, or all of that. And then I also would like you to perhaps delve into a little bit, how do you design a system that can withstand attacks on credibility? Because I have to imagine that is something that those who will eventually be indicted, or those who have been indicted, has to be one of their first lines of attack.
Absolutely. And so I'll answer the documentary evidence question first. And in reality, we like to say we make sure we're not reinventing the wheel. There are a lot of wonderful organizations out there that are already working with groups to maintain documentary evidence and chain of custody with proper standards. SJAC is one that I can note in that's doing the work in Syria. And there are other similar organizations in every atrocity situation where that evidence is already being preserved. So what we try to do there is we reach out to those who are willing to work with us and share certain confidential information that they have documented, and we compare it to what we've gathered in our own documentation. But a lot of what we start with truly is open support. The enemy says a lot while intending to say nothing. And one of the things that we've actually been able to really draw from a lot is social media. There are a lot of what we would call anchor. You can identify with social media just with videos. With some of the first and the earliest documentary efforts in Syria were done via social media. The Syrian Observatory, which we used to report to this day, started out as a Facebook update. It was daily information from the local coordination committees who were around in Syria, and they reported daily events, and then it sort of made its way up, and it was reported through social media. And that information helps identify, if nothing else, prosecutorial discretion towards investigations. It helps us narrow what are we looking at further. Obviously something like the chemical attacks in August of 2015 would be a good example of something where we want to focus on that. That open source documentation is very valuable. Some of it coming from journalists, some of it coming from sometimes even the media. They'll come in and in trying to glorify a lot of their efforts, they'll say, "Oh, well, our army, this unit walked into Damascus today and tried to kill however many terrorists." Right? Well, they're calling them terrorists to suit their narrative, but what they actually just told us was the name of the unit and cities that we can now use to investigate and determine whether the truth of that is that they were present and a crime potentially occurred. So a lot of times they gift wrap it to you. But once we start to narrow those issues down, then we do rely upon more confidential sources to really down into the documentary evidence necessary to finalize our case. And now, with regard to the credibility, there is, as everyone that's ever tried a case knows, no substitute for witness testimony. And so as we get closer to case-ready indictments, we have to start verifying some of the key allegations with witness testimony. A lot of times, as we advance our open source and our documentary investigations, we will begin to annotate counts in the indictment. Say, okay, we need witness testimony for this portion, we need witness testimony from this other portion. And then at that point, that's when we try to reach out and identify the second prong of our support base, which is our confidential partner. Many of them are already conducting and recording interviews of key eyewitness testimony, and really you can assess a lot from recorded interviews and being able to tell, relaying the story, credibility of that witness. What evidence is there that they are where they say they were at the time they said they were there. And what is it possible that they saw? And a lot of that, it can really be compared to open source documentation. A lot of the accounts that we rely on are already in the media. It's just a matter of finding someone who was there. Mm-hmm. And so really the key is collaboration in all efforts. Really trying to figure out who has the information that we need. And if nobody has it, how do we get it?
And I have to imagine, and I'm, postulating, heaven forbid, a world where, 20, 30 years down the road, we're still dealing with these types of things. 20, 30 years is probably actually, sadly, not long enough, but I wonder, will people get smarter? So you talk to teenagers today and say, be careful of what you put out on social media, because that will always be there and someone will always be able to find it. And so I can imagine a world where leaders get cagier about it and get smarter about not publicizing what they're doing. Although that in and of itself is a double-edged sword, because if they're trying to garner their support without some overt or public display of it, how will they know what to do? So perhaps the world I'm envisioning where the smart leaders aren't publicizing things is not a likelihood.
Well, and hopefully someday when GAN achieves its stated mission statement of deterring these acts, when enough prosecutions have occurred, maybe that day will come where the incident, it's not just that they're not publishing it, but they're not victimizing their own citizens. Hopefully that's the world that we get to.
Yes. Hopefully that is the world. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but I think there's this when you're in the age of the strong man, as Professor Crane has written about so widely, there's this sense of invincibility that impunity is a powerful motivator. When these people have gotten away with it for years, the thought process goes more, if I don't respond brutally today, I may not survive this conflict to be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. So I think that there is this need, as they say, there's good press, there's bad press, and there's no press, and then the first two are preferable to the latter. So even if you are, publicizing these things and making risks, I don't know if it fits into the psychology of those responsible for these crimes that someday they could be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. Even if it does, I don't think it's the prime risk on their mind. It's remarkable to me how consistently regimes build cases against themselves. We saw it with the Nazis, we see it with Assad, and I don't think we're going to stop seeing it. And it's unfortunate, but it is true.
Well, and that actually is a pretty good transition into talking a little more in depth about Syria. Recently, and by that I think I mean really over the last 5 years or so, there have been some national courts that have started prosecuting the alleged war crimes and the crimes against humanity that are associated with Syria. And I think Sweden was the first. And I think Germany, Austria, and France have also have made arrests. I'm not sure if they've actually gone to trial yet. So I think let's start with the question of what enables these national courts to do something like that, because that seems outside of how we typically think of how the law focuses, that these very external parties are prosecuting these.
Mm-hmm. So from a legal standpoint, there are many countries that are able and willing to exercise universal jurisdiction, which is conferred upon them via several treaties. The two most frequently cited would be the Convention Against Torture and the Convention Against Genocide that confer this universal jurisdiction. If you come across an individual who has broken one of these covenants, you have a duty to prosecute or extradite those individuals to a willing forum that will prosecute. There are several brave nations that have stepped up and are on the cutting edge of prosecuting these individuals in their own courts. And depending on their internal makeup, sometimes that can be done as simply as through the executive branch and their civil inquisitorial system. Sometimes it's done pursuant to statute, enabling certain provisions of the treaties to become domestic law. But in any case, really what you're doing is you're prosecuting somebody for a crime that they committed outside the territory of your state, which was not committed against your nationals. And that's why I think it's sort of, a lot of people recoil from it is that why are they doing this? But there's a reason that they call it crimes against humanity. And I think there are nations out there that are sensitive to that these crimes are I'll quote Jackson, they're so malignant and so devastating that society cannot ignore their continuing because they cannot survive their being repeated.
Nicely done.
And that was I probably butchered that, but I think that these nations and these prosecutors are starting to pick up on the fact that deterrence cannot happen if the only nations that step forward to prosecute these crimes are those who occur, in which most of the time the political situation makes prosecution.
Well, and I think some of them, because we have had conversations about the International Criminal Court, some of them will probably also wonder, well, why isn't this something that the ICC is looking at? And my recollection, actually, for both Syria and Yemen, is that they are not parties to the ICC. So in theory, the process to get a tribunal stood up is much more complicated because it has to be referred by the Security Council and then potentially move forward from there. And at least in Syria's case, I believe it has been referred or attempted, it's been come before the Security Council, I think twice, and has been vetoed by some members of the Security Council both times.
That's correct. And it does pose a challenge as, it seems to be that a lot of the nations where these things come up most often are not right to the ICC statute. And with it being a treaty court, the only way that we're going to be able to get prosecutions of a lot of these individuals, absent a relaxing of the deadlock in the Security Council, which I think we know that's unlikely, but we can all hope, is if these nations where these individuals who tire of the throes of war seek refuge, and they find individuals, and really the most important thing, especially in individual or in nations like the United States, where a certain burden before you can even indict somebody for a crime like this. And so if there are prosecutors' offices who are not confident that they can reach the level of probable cause required to indict and restrain one of these individuals, they're not gonna pick up an indictment. They're not gonna set their office up for failure. So that's another thing that we support through our sample indictments is if we are here with an individual's rap sheet in our database, one from France or Germany happens to come across this individual, we hope to be able to give them a case-ready indictment that they can take to a grand jury in the United States or an equivalent elsewhere, where this individual is going to get held and they're going to get tried and they're going to be prosecuted. And that's really the ideal of our model, is whether this is a complicated hybrid or an ad hoc, whether it's an ICC investigation or whether it's just as simple as somebody crossing the wrong border. We're coming for these people, and we want the people who are on our side to be equipped and ready to prosecute those responsible.
Well, and I know that the Syrian Accountability Project was still fairly young, I think, by the time Sweden started, about 4 years in, I think. So are you finding that these state actors, Austria, France, Germany, Sweden, are coming to the GAN, or are they going to your partners? Are they aware of the work that you're doing and trying to tap into it?
Yeah, I believe that they're aware of it. I believe we are still a young organization, and we are still increasing our Rolodex in our operation. But our board members, I think, have a much thicker Rolodex perhaps organization itself. And so we draw from that regularly, and we want to increase, and be available and increase our profile so that the organizations and prosecutors out there that are seeking to bring people to justice know we're here, know what we have, and are willing to work with us and benefit from what we've.
Great. You mentioned the Triple AIIMS earlier, which is the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism. I think I got that right. Which I think is so it's not a court, but it's sort of a creative solution to, hey, we can't quite advance this to the ICC. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Triple AIIMS?
Sure. And so I had the pleasure of meeting the Triple AIIMS executive at Chautauqua last year, and I learned a little bit. Although I won't pretend any expertise as to their operations. But Professor Crane was absolutely instrumental in helping set that Triple AIIMS up. And as I understand it, is every portion of a prosecutorial effort except at actual office of the prosecutor. It has all the same resources, all the same chain of custody protections, and it's really a clearinghouse for all of the different efforts that exist out there that are documenting, that are trying to. And the idea is I think the same really is the end, which is want to be available for when a prosecution ultimately is viable. And this is not something that I think will go away. There were many organizations in Syria that were very focused on ensuring that when the political winds change, that the individuals that are responsible, it's hard to go back to life on your street when three doors down at a checkpoint may have killed one of your family members. I mean, it's that sort of thing. Regardless of the will of the politicians, it can't continue without some kind of justice. But I think that energy will continue to hire organizations that are homegrown, that are domestic, to continue cooperating with the Triple AIIMS and the work that they're doing. When we do see a political win, justice will be done.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think I read, and I feel like it's only in the last couple of months, that there's a criminal court in Yemen that is starting to prosecute some of the Houthi rebels in absentia. And I think I just saw that, and I think it was that was the initial, and then sometime in July, they're going to reconvene. And so I'm hoping that the evidence and some of what the Yemen Accountability Project has been collecting will factor in there. But that's a fairly recent development. And so it's I'm not sure exciting is the right adjective I want there, but it's good to know that something is moving forward there.
Absolutely, and I would on that is this is when I would wish that I had my colleague Professor Johnson and our executive director Laura Graham at the Yemen Accountability Project, who I'm sure are already aware and far more well read on that particular instance than I am. But if there's a court that's looking to legitimately prosecute war criminals and those who've committed crimes against humanity, we're here to help. And I look forward to reading more about that. I'm actually going to make a note and look into that and to enrich my own reading, which admittedly in the last few months has been mostly in Venezuela.
Well, and so we did actually get a question from Daryl Cozen, who wants to know, what crimes are you looking at in Venezuela? I know it's early days yet, but just curious to see if you can give us any insight on that.
Well, so I can speak to our process generally. I think with active investigations, getting down into specific statutes, I think might be a little too far for a public broadcast. But I will say that the general things that for every atrocity situation that we look at, and believe it or not, we start with the domestic statutes, just like in Sierra Leone, just like in Syria. We obtain a authoritatively translated copy of the domestic penal law, because you can't build the rule of law if the folks in the nation state that is affected aren't seeing their laws upheld. International law is all of our laws, as they said in the Venezuela case, the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1800s. But it's different when the laws that your nation has democratically enacted and set forth are disregarded by a regime for so long. So it is important that the ultimate indictments reflect domestic crimes, murder, theft. Anything that is torture in some cases, depending on the nation. Some of these things are outlawed by the domestic laws. And then we move up a level to the the treaties that are specifically applicable to that nation, Venezuela being party to at least two that I can name offhand, which would be the enforced disappearance, the Convention Against Enforced Disappearance of Persons, which I believe they've signed and not ratified yet. But then there's also the Convention Against Torture. So violations of those conventions. But then also the Rome Statute, which Venezuela, unlike our two previous investigations, is a party to the ICC statute. So, the elements of crimes in the Rome Statute, Articles 7 and 8, are all at play. And then customary international law, the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions. These are all laws that apply by nature of their customs. We look at every single one of those, and they're all included in the crime-based matrix. They each have their own column. And we actually cite the statute article and section of every applicable provision as we build our crime-based matrix. So a lot of folks, are not familiar with, even the investigators in country are actually not familiar with all of the variety of law that could apply to the same incidents. And so that's what we try to help with our cornerstone documents. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think that was pretty thorough. One of the things I found interesting about Venezuela, and I think I'm remembering this correctly, is that was actually referred to the ICC by, I think it was 6 other member nations, which, if I'm recalling correctly, is the first time that that has happened when all of the potential crimes took place entirely within the country of Venezuela in this instance, right. So entirely within one country. That's taking sort of the being your brother's keeper concept really to the level that you do hope countries feel the need to take it to.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's the ideal. The closer to the situation that the justice mechanism is, the more reflective it is of the justice needs of the population. So I'm applaud the involvement of these regional organizations in this process. The Arab League has certainly made efforts as well in the Middle East. And the OAS is doing the same thing in South America and the United Nations more generally. But the closer to the situation, the better. And that states party referral, you're correct. That is the first in the history of the court. And it is moving through the process. There is a preliminary examination that's been opened, and they are examining whether or not that needs to be subject to a full investigation. So that's just an example, and that was actually preceded by some of our friends, Erwin Cochran, actually at the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, who did a wonderful report that was the impetus behind that. And so it goes to show how a lot of this work begins at the NGO level and is then taken by the appropriate authorities with international personality upon and build political coalitions, find meaningful action. That's what we're here to do. We want to support those efforts. We want to create the factual basis for political change. And we're an impartial organization that investigates all sides of every conflict. And so we like to emphasize that. And we're not playing politics. We're here for justice.
Well, and that leads me to, I think, probably my last question before we open it up to questions for our audience. And that I feel like one of the, I'll say, largest criticisms I feel as if I have read of these types of prosecutions is that the prosecutions typically focus on the side that was in power, if they're no longer in power, or the side that is in power, depending on the situation. There are, there's the conversation certainly that, well, all prosecutions have some element of discretion to them. So, there's that. But what you just said also just sort of triggered to me because, and I'm thinking of, can't remember if it was Syria or, well, Venezuela, I know, filed a complaint that says the sanctions against it were resulting in crimes against humanity. And then I think it was Syria that they were also focused on some of the activities that some others had done to what would be essentially prisoners of war. And I'm sorry, I can't remember if that was Syria or Yemen, but one of those where they're like, well, if you're looking at us, why aren't you looking at that? And it sounds as if you have just said, well, we're taking the holistic view.
Absolutely. And that's a good point. You can look at the prosecutions in Sierra Leone as an example where, the Revolutionary United Front was prosecuted thoroughly throughout the indictees list, as well as Charles Taylor and his direct henchmen. And so that's what we envision is that sides that are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity are going to be prosecuted. I think one of the reasons that that problem is so visual and is so often repeated, though, it sometimes comes down to a lot of the legal prerequisites for those prosecutions. The Rome Statute, for example, has as a prerequisite that the crimes that you're prosecuting are part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population. If you're not the government, if you're not the regime, your capacity to commit that kind of an attack is not quite the same. So I think a lot of that is self-selecting by the way the law is written, and some of the other bad actors who may have done things that the regime like. Well, they didn't do so using color of law and with the levers of the state. So those crimes may be prosecuted more in the domestic setting, whereas the regime crimes find their way into a courtroom like the ones that we would be.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we will open it up to questions from our audience now. As a reminder, I'm speaking with Jeff Howe, who is the Executive Director and Chief Counsel of the Global Accountability Network. Jeff, this is usually the time I ask, what is in your mug? So
it is white tea. It's about 95 degrees. So I will say that the mug is being used, but because you guys were generous enough to send it to me, but it is iced. So that I remain comfortable.
Sounds like a perfect summer tea. So I'm actually also drinking a white tea. Mine has some peach flavor to it. Mm-hmm. So it's from my hometown of Pittsburgh. So I like to utilize the hometown teas wherever possible.
Absolutely.
All right. So we have another question from Daryl Kozen. And it is, why would a government want to document their systematic killing of their citizens?
So
in that Syria, so.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually two examples I can point to on that. Really, I think the one I see the most often that just kind of comes right off the tip of the tongue is ignoring the orders are being carried out. One of the reasons why these things are reported is because government looks at individuals who have the certain charisma and gravitas that are encouraging other people to participate. Be it protests, be it rebellious acts, whatever, these people are problematic. And they recognize that if they're trying to oppress a populace and they find people who've risen above that fear, those people have to be taken out. They're a threat to the regime. So if you don't have a system for identifying and ensuring that these individuals who have been disappeared or murdered, that order has been carried out, you can't be sure they're not going to pop up again somewhere else. That was what we saw with the report. I believe one of my colleagues, Ambassador Stephen Rapp, noted that all of the records for these individuals would note that they died of cardiac arrest. Well, we're all going to die of cardiac arrest. It's just the cause that prior to that may have been a bullet or gas or whatever the particular method of the day is. But that's one reason for the documentation is certainly to identify that all of the troublemakers, the targets, the rabble rousers that the regime sees as a threat are being taken care of. But also to make sure that the chain of command is still functioning. To make sure that the people on the front lines are obeying the orders at the top. The same machine that is required to run that documentation and the ability to franchise the desires of the regime to military orders on the ground, that's their biggest strength and their biggest weakness. Because they have to have a certain level of documentation and written communications in order to make that work. And then they don't necessarily contemplate by the time defeat is evident. They destroy as much as they can, but their ability to do so is diminished at that time. So I think that's probably the best explanation I've been able to conjure in my time working in this, is that it really is more about control. And about ensuring that what is being ordered is actually being carried out.
And given the personalities of these types of leaders, that makes sense to me that's control is something that would be fairly paramount to them. And
right.
So need to follow that.
Right. It's hard to hold your subordinates to any kind of standard if you don't know what they've done. Like, how many of my orders have you carried out? How many, right. How many protesters have you detained? How many, individuals have been that are problematic? It all has to be documented for you to have, as macabre as it is to say, any assessment of how well you're doing in your struggle against the war or the uprising or whatever it may be.
Okay, we have a question from Helena, and it's about the use of technology to document some of these. So she's heard about secure apps for victims or for witnesses, so they could be uploaded in real time. Is that something that GAN, I'm not sure if you use it specifically or you coordinate its use, or how does that factor in?
With care. So the one that I'm the most familiar with was actually put together by DLA Piper, I think in 15 or 16, and it's called Eyewitness. That was a collaboration between several groups led by DLA Piper in DC. And the impetus behind it was that there were so many things happening and people needed to be able to record them, upload them, and keep some semblance of chain of custody. We've all seen the videos on YouTube where, and are horrifying and disturbing, but they don't always rise to the level of evidence because they miss the indicators of authenticity that we require to be able to use them in court. So a lot of these apps have been designed to solve for those variables and to allow people who are already risking their lives in the conflict or already with training or with support from different organizations doing these things. And it's really designed to support people who are already on the front lines and have access to these things. And that's absolutely one source we're aware of and that we intend to consult as we move forward into each new phase of our investigations. But the challenge is that there are petabytes of this information out there, and the manpower needed to sift through some of which may be horrific scenes, but may not be presenting evidence of criminal conduct. Bombing is a horrific scene, but if that bombing is hitting a weapons cache, it's not evidence of a crime. So we need to have the ability to go back and look at all of this information and figure out what is evidence of a crime, and that we need to look further and try to figure out who took this video, who testified in court that they were there, thought that this was a fair and accurate representation at that particular time. That work happens as we get closer to the sample indictment stages. The key in our initial phases is you have to narrow down which incidents you're looking into, because otherwise, if you try to start with the data that's there and try to work back to incidents, you'll be 30, 40 years before you get through it all. And so there does have to be a certain degree of discretion in how do we sort out what's out there. So we're trying to solve for those variables first, and that information and say, okay, now we've got it narrowed down to the 10 incidents that we want to prosecute. Now let's start.
Well, and I have to imagine for at least some of these areas that we're talking about as well, access to technology in and of itself might be a challenge. So whether it's because the communities are socioeconomically disadvantaged, or because the conflict has been going on for so long that a lot of that infrastructure has been damaged, that the amount of boots on the ground needs for personal contact still must be very significant.
It absolutely is, and it varies widely by country. In Syria, you find a population that is very familiar and used to having access to electronics and internet, and so they're very familiar with that. That's why Eyewitness was really made, was for that population, that they're familiar with telecom, they have access to it. But you run into the problem of you could have the best, most updated technology in the world, and if the regime is going to shut the internet off in the area right before they go in to do something that they know is they don't want publicized, that creates a big problem with it being any kind of data, and which is, I believe, one of the things Eyewitness was designed to it archived it on the phone. You didn't need internet connectivity. You didn't need to have an active connection to be able to get this stuff. And when you go to maybe an internet cafe or where somewhere where there is a connection, you can then upload it to a secure server that is in some way accessed by organizations like ours. That's always a challenge as we move forward in trying to figure out how do we integrate technology into these prosecutions efforts, and how do we turn data into evidence. That was actually one of the biggest discussions that we had at Chautauqua. It's definitely going on at the highest levels of our practice, and it's a continuing challenge, but it's definitely one we're all aware of, and we're all trying to tackle as best as we can.
Yes, I remember that discussion at the International Humanitarian Law Roundtable. We are inundated with data, but getting it to actually work for you can be a challenging prospect. All right, Daryl has another question, and this is going a little bit further afield, but could Saudi Arabia be prosecuted for the Khashoggi murder by the ICC? Or are we getting too far afield there?
So that's an interesting thought, and of course, you immediately see me go up into my lawyer brain. I'd be slow to comment on that officially, but I'll tell you my initial inclination is that the ICC's murder as a weapon of war is really intended to be in the context of an armed conflict or widespread and systemic attack against civilian populations. Assassinations or murders, that are outside that context would not typically be within the ambit of the statute. So I'm not saying he can't be, but I would have some doubts as to whether or not that would meet the first prerequisite of, when compared with an airstrike, for example, or some of the things we've seen that are horrifying in Yemen, where schools, weddings, school buses have been attacked by either drones or active airstrikes. That's a killing that, even though they're trying to reach one or two people in that location, it as part of the overall war effort. So I'm not familiar with any case law that would support the idea that a single murder or assassination would fall under that. But I'd be interested to learn more on that. If anyone does, anyone out there that's listening has a case on that, or anything, please send it our way. I'd love to read it.
Well, and at least in my mind, it certainly seems as if it would potentially, again, depending on what the law is in Saudi Arabia, potentially violate a state law, a country law.
Exactly. Yes. And I think that would be the preferred form.
Yep. All right. We do not have any additional questions at this time, Jeff. I really want to thank you for spending the part of the afternoon with us and talking to us about the Global Accountability Network. Oftentimes I end these with asking what could our viewers, our audience do to contribute to the effort or to help in some way. So I will ask you that question.
Sure. Well, we are a 501c3 non-stock that's set up in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And we, of course, like any nonprofit, we are set up and we operate on grants and donations. So if anyone is interested in supporting us, our website will be coming online here in the next few months. We are still getting that up and running. In the meantime, I will share my email, and if anyone wants to reach out to me, we would love to have anyone support, either volunteer support or financial support for those who have expertise in these. We're always looking for new volunteers and new partners. But I can be reached. Our organization is actually housed at our law firm here, Parazonium Law Group in Virginia Beach. So my email is jeff@parazoniumlawgroup.com, and I'll spell that. It's ARAZONIUM. And if you would like to assist us, more than happy to receive your contribution. We'll go to a good cause. Aside from that, more to follow. Be on the lookout for our website, and we will be having a more convenient PayPal or app for donations here in the future.
That's great. And so I know the Syrian Accountability Project and the Yemen Accountability Project and eventually the Venezuela Accountability Project are all situated at law schools or universities. Can non-law students or non-university attendees participate in those as well? So for example, if you need translators or something along that line, can they help that way?
Absolutely. Anybody that has a skill set that we require, you don't have to be a member of a law school, or it's usually where we find the interested individuals that can benefit through academic credit or things of that nature. But if you want to help out, we certainly, the three things we would need, I would say the most right now would be Arabic competencies, Spanish, now that we've been into a new continent, and particularly if you have any courtroom translation experience, if you've ever worked as a court translator or anything to that's especially helpful, because a lot of times it isn't just translating, it's also translating legal documents and having that fluency. So that's a different level of translation than typical. But we do still need, we have translators that assist us with indigenous language news sources, so that those are included. Google are, so having individuals that can double check the key evidence that we rely on for our case dossiers is always something that people can. That's always appreciated.
All right, and audience, thank you for being with us today for Tea Time with the Jackson Center. Please join us next Thursday at 3 p.m. We will be talking with Avery Gardner, Lydia Brown, and Hannah Quay de la Valle from the Center for Democracy and Technology. And we'll be talking about tech equity and the challenges both with striving for that and achieving it. So Jeff, thank you very much for being with us here today. And audience, thank you for being with us as well. Have a good day.
Thank you for inviting me. Have a great day.